So, is there a positive, like a proactive agenda to Antifa? Because for instance, Black Lives Matter, which you would say is at the very least, an anti-white supremacy group, also comes out with a set of policy statements that are very proactive, right? I mean, there are issue sets that they want that are beyond or are part of, I guess, degrading white supremacy in this country. Is there anything analogous to that within Antifa, or is it just simply defined as getting rid of fascists?
So there's sort of a range of perspectives among anti-fascist groups, both in North America and Europe. Some focus more on organizing in communities, trying to inoculate people who might potentially be sympathetic to a sort of fascist or white supremacist message, inoculate them against those messages, promote anti-racist propaganda, try to organize sometimes through the labor movement. So in the U.S., we could see, for example, the General Defense Committees of the Industrial Workers of the World Labor Union are essentially labor-oriented, mass, anti-racist, anti-fascist formations that don't cover their faces and don't operate in the exact same way as Antifa groups. And then there are groups who focus more on trying to short-circuit the advance of white supremacist organizing. And then there's sort of a range in between. In countries like Spain or France, there are Antifa assemblies where people from different unions and community groups kind of come together and share resources. Some of them are sort of what we would say as more explicitly Antifa groups that participate. Others are not. So there's sort of a range of perspectives, but it all kind of comes back to the point that different leftists will sort of disagree about policy prescriptions, about what the future should look like, but to some extent those are put aside in this struggle, and that's why it sort of comes across sometimes as more of a reactive politics, a politics of self-defense. But certainly, fascism grows when people's needs are not being met, when they're desperate, and we can see that historically with the Great Depression. We can see it with the rise of the far right in Europe after the financial crisis of 2008. So part of it is sort of advancing the left, part of it is short-circuiting the far right, and then there's perspectives in between.
Are there major tactical differences within those who self-identify as Antifa?
There are. Before even getting into that, one thing to clarify is what sort of differentiates Antifa from what the Europeans call the anti-racist movement, or from a kind of official governmental anti-fascism of states like Germany or Italy, is that they disagree with pursuing legislative bans on hate speech or the far right. They're direct action-oriented politics. That having been said, within the kind of milieu, there are some that focus more on mass organizing, some that focus more on confrontation. But generally speaking, the groups that I've spoke to, the individuals I spoke to, really emphasize that each location, each context requires its own responses. Most of what anti-fascists do is what we would call nonviolent organizing, researching the far right, exposing who these people are, what kinds of social media networks they work through, contacting venues to cancel conferences at hotels or white power skinhead punk shows at VFWs or American Legions. And in that way, it's very contextual. I spoke to some groups, for example, in Denmark in the 1990s, one of the most common tactics was calling the parents of young skinheads and telling them what they were up to try and, make it so they couldn't go out of the house anymore. So it is very contextual, and how they do it varies. I spoke to a Norwegian who said in Norway the anti-fascists really emphasized forming coalitions with unions and political parties to make a really broad front against fascism. Some of the Swedes I spoke to disagreed with that. So there are differences of opinion.
From a taxonomy perspective, what is black bloc tactics and Antifa tactics? I mean, just give me the sense of the taxonomy there.
Sure. So the black bloc, for listeners who are unfamiliar, is essentially a tactic, not a specific group. There is no specific black bloc. Any group of people could form one by simply dressing uniformly in black, covering their faces. And the idea is that's a way for groups of people to carry out militant direct actions without being identified. It grew out of the autonomous movement of Germany in the 1980s and was used to defend squats, to also fight back against a really virulent neo-Nazi skinhead wave that emerged after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So if you'd have a few thousand neo-Nazis celebrating the birthday of Hitler, German anti-fascists would form a black bloc to confront them. It's since spread around the world largely in the anarchist movement. It can be used for any kind of political context. Probably the most famous use of it in the U.S. was the Battle of Seattle in 1999, the protests against the World Trade Organization. A lot of anti-fascists will use this tactic, but plenty will not. I spoke to British anti-fascists who said that, in the 80s and 90s, they preferred to dress in casuals, which is sort of your kind of typical kind of football hooligan type look, so that the police couldn't tell if they were fascist or anti-fascist or football fans or what have you. So it depends on the context. A lot of anti-fascists will use a black bloc, but it's not synonymous. People can use black blocs for anything, and it's certainly not the best option for every political situation, and not all anti-fascists use it.
So black bloc is a tactic, and anti-fascism is almost a strategy, yes?
Yep, sure, you could say that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and because it's amazing to me how much license is taken with just these terms, and generally as a way of by way of smearing. Groups of people in protests.
Right, and that's been one of the most astounding things is how much journalists and politicians and pundits are willing to say while knowing so little. And in writing my book, I was addressing articles that came out after the various anti-fascist protests that have burst into the headlines over the past 6 months or so, and arguments about what anti-fascism leads to, arguments about what shutting down the far right inevitably produces, are almost always just grounded in analytical speculation and treat anti-fascism as if it's kind of a thought experiment that some crazy kids came up with, rather than a fairly well-defined political strategy, agree with it or disagree with it, that has developed over the course of decades in multiple countries.
Right. The point being is that we have data. We don't have to speculate whether or not there's a slippery slope. We can look back to history to see if one gets created in these instances.
Right, and the pattern that I found, which I think is really interesting and is almost never mentioned or looked into, is that if you interview an anti-fascist who has a local group, you ask them, why did your group form when it formed? Well, they'll usually say there was a local neo-Nazi skinhead group, or there was this anti-Semitic group passing out this information, so we formed a group to stop them. Okay, your group lasted for 4 years. Why did it stop? Well, it stopped because the local fascist group stopped organizing and everyone went back to being environmentalists or trade unionists or what have you. So the lifespan of these groups is almost always directly linked to the rise and fall of the far right. It's a defensive activity that was true back in the 20s and 30s. It's true today. So the notion that when the local fascist or far right group is stopped, that anti-fascists will inevitably start shutting down, anyone they quote unquote disagree with is just, I've never come across that happening. So we have decades of data across multiple countries. So it's not a speculation that's really informed by information.
I guess the hard part, one of the questions I was going to ask you is, obviously the agenda is to get rid of the fascists or to disrupt their organizing, to quash them, to nip them in the bud before they get increase in power and in numbers and whatnot. And I guess on a local level, it's sort of easier to tell if you've been successful. But how much coordination is there, let's say nationally in this country? How much is that group in that anti-fascist group in Illinois? How much of its processes and its vetting, let's say, and its organizational structure, to the extent that there is one, how similar is that to one in Oakland or in, let's say, North Carolina?
Sure. So one thing to point out is that there is a national network called the Torch Network that has about a dozen groups affiliated, and they share resources and information and so forth. And so I would imagine that they coordinate more than your average Antifa group. Some groups shared information about their vetting methods for new members. Others did not. I know some groups simply don't accept new members. Others go through an extensive background check process. Certainly, if there's a local white supremacist leader who moves from one city to another, often the group from the original city will notify the new city that they should keep an eye on this new person. So it depends. There is coordination, but a lot of it really grows out of local circumstances and local perspectives. And so there's similarities but differences. And the thing is, a lot of this information, a lot of the answer probably will never really be made public because these groups tend to be not very open.
And they're not open because both of concerns about state action, but also concerns of fascist action.
Right. So, I mean, for example, I spoke to a prominent Danish anti-fascist named Rasmus Preston, who made the unorthodox decision of making his identity and his work entirely public, and he was assaulted 4 or 5 times in the course of about 18 months. He got numerous threats. So this is the kind of thing that people are concerned about if you have a family and a job. And many of the people that I spoke to have really a wide range of jobs, from nurses to teachers to clerks to grocery store workers, and they just don't want to deal with all of that in their personal life, and also they don't want groups to be infiltrated because that has happened in both directions, and it's a risky business. It's not something that people enter into lightly. All of the anti-fascists I spoke to would much rather this not be a problem. They'd rather spend their time on more productive kinds of political activity to build a better world, but it is a threat, and they take it seriously.
What is the value of them identifying as Antifa? I mean,
that's an interesting point because, especially now that the term has gained a lot of common misconceptions and a lot of negativity, frankly. I know that there are some groups who don't use the term to avoid that. And we could even see early on the decision by anti-racist action in the 80s and 90s, which modeled itself on the British anti-fascist action, but chose the language of anti-racism in part because they felt like it fit better in the American context, that you don't have to call yourself this, you don't have to use the word. It started being used more in the U.S. in the late 2000s. So the oldest currently existing Antifa group in the U.S. is Rose City Antifa in Portland, Oregon. And they chose it in part because they had some European members, in part because they wanted to have a closer connection to the European movement. Part of it has to do with that kind of aesthetic, that transnational aesthetic. But certainly in the future, groups will choose carefully whether to use a name or not, because especially if a group wants to be more open and have their identities more public and do more mass work, it may not be a useful term to use. So those are all things to be taken into account for sure.
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos